If you ever find yourself alone on a remote mountain lake at 2 in the morning and a man pulls his boat alongside yours without any fishing gear in sight, do not look him in the eye and do not tell him where you are parked. I learned that lesson the hard way on the black waters of Spirit Lake, where the silence of the deep woods is so thick you can hear your own heartbeat, and where I realized far too late that the man in the aluminum boat wasn't looking for trout. He was looking for a witness to bury. I had been out on the water for nearly 5 hours, the surface of the lake looking like a sheet of polished obsidian under the sliver of a waning moon. The only sound was the occasional rhythmic slap of water against my hull and the distant, mournful cry of a loon that seemed to echo for miles through the dense wall of pine trees surrounding the shore. I enjoy night fishing because it demands a certain level of sensory deprivation, a complete focus on the vibration of the line between your fingers, but that night, the air felt unnaturally heavy, as if a storm were brewing just behind the ridges. I was about 300 yards from my launch point, a small dirt clearing where my truck sat hidden by the brush, when I heard the low, guttural hum of a small outboard motor approaching from the northern arm of the lake. It was unusual to see anyone else out this late, especially since the only other access point was a steep, rocky boat ramp 6 miles away that most people avoided after sunset. I watched the small white light of the approaching vessel cutting through the mist, moving slowly and deliberately toward my position in the center of the deep water. As the boat drew closer, the hum of the engine cut out, and the vessel began to coast forward on its own momentum until it was drifting barely 10 feet away from my port side. The man sitting in the middle bench was wearing a heavy, oil-stained canvas coat despite the humid night air, and his face was cast in deep shadow by the brim of a ragged baseball cap. He didn't have a rod in his hand, and I noticed with a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline that there wasn't a single piece of fishing equipment in his boat. No tackle box, no net, and no cooler. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, watching me with a stillness that felt predatory. "Any luck tonight?" he asked, his voice sounding like dry gravel rubbing together in the vast silence of the wilderness. I forced a tight, artificial smile and told him I had caught a few small ones but was about to pack it in for the night. "It's a big lake for a man to be all by himself," he replied, and he didn't move an inch as his boat drifted even closer, the metal hulls of our crafts almost touching now. "I'm looking for my daughter. She went for a walk near the old logging camp on the east bank this afternoon and she hasn't come back yet." A wave of cold dread washed over me because I had spent the entire afternoon scouting that specific bank, and it was nothing but a vertical cliff face of jagged rock and impenetrable briars where no child could possibly walk. I stared at the empty floor of his boat and realized there were several heavy, industrial-sized cinder blocks sitting near the stern, wrapped in thick nylon rope that trailed off into a dark pile under the bench. Why would a man searching for a missing child in the woods be out in the middle of the deepest part of the lake with heavy weights and rope? "I haven't seen anyone on the east bank today, sir," I said, my voice trembling slightly as I reached for the pull cord of my own motor. "Maybe you should head back to the ramp and call the sheriff. They have search teams for this kind of thing." The man finally looked up, and the moonlight caught his eyes, which were wide and unblinking, fixed on me with a terrifying intensity that made my skin crawl. "The sheriff doesn't need to be involved in family business," he whispered, and he began to reach slowly into the deep pocket of his canvas coat. I didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. I yanked the starter cord with every ounce of strength I had, and the motor roared to life, kicking up a spray of cold water as I jammed the throttle forward. I didn't head for my truck immediately because I didn't want him to know where I was parked, so I aimed for the thickest part of the lily pads on the southern shore, hoping to lose him in the shadows. Behind me, I heard his outboard engine scream into life, a high-pitched whine that sounded like a mechanical animal chasing me through the dark. He was faster than I was, his boat being lighter and more powerful, and I could see his silhouette standing up as he steered, gaining ground with every passing second. I turned sharply toward a narrow inlet choked with fallen timber, a place where a larger boat would surely snag its prop, and I felt my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Why was he following me so relentlessly if he was just a grieving father? The questions raced through my mind, but the primary instinct was survival, the raw need to get away from those cinder blocks and that nylon rope. As I banked into the inlet, my hull scraped against a submerged log, sending a jarring vibration through my teeth, but I kept the engine pinned. I looked back and saw him stop at the mouth of the narrow channel, his boat idling as he watched me disappear into the black maw of the overhanging trees. He knew the lake better than I did, and he knew that this inlet was a dead end that led to a marshy swamp with no exit. I cut my engine and let the boat drift into the tall reeds, the silence returning so suddenly it felt like a physical blow. I sat there in the dark, holding my breath, listening to the distant idle of his motor waiting out there in the open water. He was playing a game of patience, waiting for me to realize I was trapped so he could finish whatever he had started. I looked at the shoreline, which was a wall of tangled roots and mud, and realized I had to abandon the boat if I wanted to live. I stepped out into the waist-deep water, the cold mud sucking at my boots as I dragged myself toward the bank, leaving my gear and my boat behind. I crawled into the dense undergrowth, the thorns tearing at my skin, and huddled behind a massive rotted oak tree. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and then I heard the slow, rhythmic splash of oars. He had turned off his engine and was rowing into the inlet, moving silently through the reeds, searching for the man who had seen too much. I watched from the shadows as he glided past my abandoned boat, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog like a surgical laser. He stopped when he saw my empty seat, and he stepped out onto the mud exactly where I had stood moments before. He began to scan the ground, looking for my tracks, and I realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't just a man in a boat. He was a hunter who was used to tracking prey in the dark. I began to back away, inch by inch, moving deeper into the lightless heart of the woods, not knowing if I was walking towards safety or further into his trap. Would he find my truck before I did? Was there someone else waiting in the trees? I didn't know the answers, but as I heard the snap of a twig only 20 yards behind me, I realized the nightmare on the lake was only the beginning of a very long night. I found myself standing in the middle of a literal wall of water as the sky opened up over the Sawtooth Wilderness, and within minutes, the dry trail had turned into a rushing sluice of mud and loose shale. My original plan had been to reach the lower basin before sunset, but the mountain had other ideas, and the rapid drop in temperature told me that if I didn't find shelter soon, I would be facing a very real case of hypothermia before the sun even thought about coming up. I remembered seeing an old, faded marking on my topographic map for a Forestry Service outpost, a small ranger station that had supposedly been decommissioned back in the late 90s after a series of budget cuts. I pushed through a thicket of soaking wet mountain laurel, my lungs burning with every breath of the thin, cold air, until I saw the silhouette of a small structure perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. It looked exactly like a place that had been forgotten by time, with gray, weathered cedar siding that was peeling away in long strips and windows that were covered in layers of grime and old spiderwebs. The heavy iron lock on the front door had been rusted shut for years, but the frame was swollen from the moisture, and with one hard shove from my shoulder, the wood groaned and gave way, allowing me to stumble into the pitch-black interior. The air inside smelled of stale pine needles and the metallic tang of old batteries, but it was dry, and for that, I was prepared to be immensely grateful. I clicked on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a small room furnished with nothing but a metal desk, a rusted filing cabinet, and a heavy cast iron wood stove sitting in the corner. I moved toward the stove, thinking I could perhaps find some old scraps of paper or dry wood to start a small fire to dry my boots, but as I got closer, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. There was a faint, shimmering heat haze dancing above the black iron surface of the stove, and when I reached out a hand to test the air, I felt a wave of radiating warmth that shouldn't have been there. I knelt down and pulled open the heavy firebox door, and my heart hammered against my ribs when I saw a bed of glowing red coals pulsing in the back of the grate. Someone had built a fire in this abandoned station less than an hour ago, and the heat was still very much alive in the belly of the iron. I stood up slowly, my headlamp sweeping across the room with a new, frantic energy, and that was when I noticed the other details I had missed in my initial rush to get out of the rain. On the metal desk, there was a tin cup that was still faintly steaming, and next to it sat a small pile of whittled cedar shavings that looked fresh and bright against the dark wood. My mind began to race through the possibilities, wondering if perhaps a fellow hiker had seen the storm and taken refuge here. But there was no backpack, no sleeping bag, and no extra gear anywhere in the small main room. I was standing in a space that was clearly being occupied, yet it felt as empty as a tomb. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and brittle against the drumming of the rain on the tin roof above me. There was no answer, only the steady drip of water from my own jacket hitting the floorboards with a rhythmic, maddening sound. I walked toward the back of the station where a small door led to a supply closet or perhaps a bunk room, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a voice or a footstep, but a soft, rhythmic clicking coming from inside the wall to my left, like the sound of someone tapping a fingernail against a hollow pipe. I pulled my hand back as if the door handle were white-hot and retreated toward the center of the room, my eyes fixed on the shadows in the corners where the light of my headlamp couldn't quite reach. Why would someone be hiding in the walls of a derelict building in the middle of a torrential downpour? I thought about the reports I had read of people disappearing in these woods, of fugitives who used the vastness of the wilderness to slip through the cracks of society, and I realized I was potentially sharing a 10 by 10 space with someone who didn't want to be found. I decided then that the rain was a far better alternative than staying in that room, so I turned back toward the front door, but as I did, I noticed that the heavy wooden bar, which had been leaning against the wall when I entered, was now slid firmly across the brackets of the door. I hadn't moved it, and the wind certainly couldn't have lifted a 20-pound piece of oak and dropped it perfectly into place. Someone had locked me in from the inside while my back was turned, and they had done it with the silence of a ghost. I felt a surge of panic that nearly made me lose my breath, and I scrambled toward the window, desperately trying to rub the grime away so I could see a way out, but the glass was reinforced with heavy wire mesh that was bolted directly into the exterior siding. I was trapped in a box with a dying fire and a hidden observer. I turned around, my back against the glass, and saw a small section of the floorboards near the stove begin to lift, just a fraction of an inch at a time. A pair of eyes, pale and reflecting the light of my lamp like an animal's, peered up through the gap in the wood. The person beneath the floor didn't say a word. They just watched me with a terrifying, vacant intensity that suggested they had been living in the dark for a very long time. I realized then that the clicking I had heard earlier wasn't a pipe. It was the sound of them communicating with someone else. From the ceiling above me, the same rhythmic clicking started up, a slow and deliberate response that echoed through the small cabin. There wasn't just one person in the station with me. There was an entire group living in the spaces between the walls, moving like rats through the guts of the building. I grabbed the heavy metal poker from beside the stove, my knuckles white as I held it like a club, and I screamed for them to stay back, but the clicking only grew louder and faster. The floorboards began to creak in multiple places at once, and the door to the back room slowly began to creak open, revealing a darkness that seemed deeper than the night outside. I knew I had seconds before they came out into the light, and I knew that if I didn't break that door down, I would become another missing person report that the Rangers would never solve. I threw my entire weight against the barred door, the wood splintering but holding firm against the oak beam. I heard a soft, wet thud as someone dropped from a hatch in the ceiling behind me, landing with a grace that was sickening to witness. I didn't look back. I just grabbed the heavy filing cabinet and shoved it with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, toppling it toward the center of the room to create an obstacle. I kicked at the lower panel of the door, the wood finally giving way enough for me to see the rain-slicked rocks outside, and I dove through the opening just as a hand reached out from the shadows to grab the heel of my boot. I scrambled into the darkness, the freezing rain feeling like a blessing as I sprinted blindly into the trees, not caring about the mud or the cliffs or the cold. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and even when I reached the safety of the trailhead hours later, I couldn't stop looking at the dark line of the woods. I keep thinking about that fire in the stove, and how they must have been sitting there in the dark, watching me from the walls the entire time I was trying to get warm. The blast of the flare gun ripped through the profound darkness of the pine forest, a sudden, blinding star against the velvet black sky that made me jump so hard I nearly dropped my thermos. It wasn't the distant, muffled pop of a firework or a hunting signal. This was the unmistakable, earth-shattering crack of an emergency signal fired with intent. I had been halfway through setting up my hammock camp near the old logging road, enjoying the near-absolute silence of the Montana backcountry, when that brilliant red beacon shot 300 feet into the air, hung there for a terrifyingly long moment, and then slowly began its descent, casting an eerie crimson glow over the swaying treetops before it fizzled out. My first instinct was pure adrenaline-fueled concern. No one fires a flare unless they are in serious trouble, and I was at least 12 miles from the nearest paved road and a good 5 miles from any sort of marked trail. The person who fired that flare was deep in the heart of nowhere, and they needed help immediately. I quickly packed my small first aid kit, grabbed my headlamp, and started running toward the general direction of the flare, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The terrain was rough, a tangled mess of fallen timber and dense underbrush, and the air was still and cold, carrying the damp scent of pine needles and wet earth. I pushed through the dense thickets for what felt like an hour, calling out every few minutes, "Hello! Is anyone there? Do you need help?" My voice was swallowed by the vastness of the woods, echoing back at me with an unnerving hollowness. I kept my headlamp scanning the ground, looking for any sign of a person. A dropped backpack, a broken branch, anything that would indicate someone had passed this way in a hurry. The only thing I found was a strange, almost pristine lack of human disturbance, which was odd given the urgency of the flare. After about 2 miles, I finally stumbled into a small, rocky clearing where the ground was mostly bare and covered in thin, wiry moss. In the center of the clearing, something glinted in the faint moonlight. It was a tripod, a professional-grade camera tripod, standing perfectly upright, and on top of it, instead of a camera, sat a small battery-powered timer. The kind you'd use for time-lapse photography, but it was connected to something else. As I got closer, I saw that it was wired to a small, empty flare gun, the spent casing still smoking faintly in the muzzle. My stomach dropped with a sickening lurch. This wasn't a distress signal. It was a deliberate trap. Someone had set this up not to call for help, but to lure someone in, to lure me in. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was the hero, and I had just walked right into their carefully laid bait. I swung my headlamp around wildly, searching the tree line for any sign of movement, any hint of who would do something so twisted. The woods were silent again, but this time, the silence felt heavy, suffocating, as if something was watching me from every shadow. "Is anyone here?" I shouted, my voice laced with a tremor of fear, but it was just a reflex. I already knew the answer. I was alone in that clearing, and whoever had set the trap was undoubtedly nearby, enjoying the spectacle of my panic. I looked down at the timer on the tripod, and my blood ran cold when I saw the digital display. It wasn't counting down to 0. It was counting up. It was a stopwatch, displaying the elapsed time since the flare had been fired. It had been exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes since the signal shot into the sky. This wasn't just a prank, it was a sick game, a hunt. They weren't trying to capture me. They were watching me, observing my reaction, savoring the fear they had instilled. I started to back away slowly, my eyes scanning the dense undergrowth, trying to imagine where someone would hide to get the best view of the clearing. The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the pine needles, and I swore I heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the breeze, a sound that was less like words and more like a soft, amused exhalation. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, retracing my steps back toward my camp, but every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I would see a pair of eyes reflecting my headlamp beam from the darkness behind me. The woods, which had felt so peaceful just an hour ago, now seemed alive with menace, every shadow a potential hiding spot, every gust of wind a sinister breath. When I finally burst back into my small clearing, my tent was still standing and my hammock was untouched. But there was something new. On the small, folding table I had set up earlier, a single, perfectly smooth river stone lay on top of my map. I hadn't put it there. I stared at the stone, my mind trying to make sense of the gesture. A calling card? A warning? It was an intimate invasion, a clear sign that whoever was out there had been to my camp, knew exactly where I was, and had likely watched me leave in my frantic search. I packed my camp with a speed I didn't know I possessed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely buckle the straps of my backpack. I left my small stove and a few non-essentials behind, just wanting to be out of there as fast as humanly possible. The sun was still hours from rising, and the darkness felt heavier, more oppressive than before. Every tree seemed to loom, every shadow to stretch into something predatory. I didn't dare use my headlamp, instead relying on the sliver of moonlight filtering through the canopy, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperate to reach the logging road. As I pushed through the final thicket and saw the familiar dirt track of the old logging road, a wave of desperate relief washed over me. But it was short-lived. In the middle of the road, directly in my path, sat a single, small, hand-painted wooden sign. It wasn't one of the old forestry signs. It was new, crafted with care, and nailed into a fallen log. On it, etched in crude but deliberate letters, were the words, "Thanks for playing. Better luck next time." My blood ran cold. They weren't just watching me. They were interacting with me, taunting me. This wasn't some random act of depravity. It was personal, a deliberate targeting. I looked up and down the empty logging road, the silence stretching out like an accusation. The words on the sign echoed in my mind, a chilling promise of future encounters. I didn't know who they were or why they had chosen me, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never look at a flare in the night sky the same way again. The deep woods had become a hunting ground, and I had just been the prey.